Hello, my name is Dr. Gerald Gall, and this is my presentation on Niccolò Paganini's 1833 Terzetto Concertante for viola, cello, and guitar. This presentation is in partial fulfillment of the requirements of a class on music of the 19th century with Dr. Sumner-Lott at Georgia State University. I'd like to acknowledge help that I got from the violinist Olga Kosovich. I'm going to divide this presentation into three parts. The first part is going to be about the background of the terzetto and some of the music that put it within the context of 1833. The second part of my presentation is an examination of one of the violin sonatas from the 1820s and how that relates to the music of the terzetto. And finally, I'm going to look at a little bit more of the music of the terzetto, and I'm going to put it in the context of the music that followed. I'm going to start by playing a little bit of the closing melody of the first movement of the terzetto. If that sounds a little dancey to you, it's because it is. It's an imitation of a dance. It was very popular in Paris and London in the 1830s, the quadrille. The quadrille was a little bit like square dancing. It was very widely danced, so people would have recognized the tune in this first movement, and there are other aspects of the first movement that also sound like the quadrille. The quadrille later became the can-can, and we may see this melody that way today, but the 1830s were a much more innocent time. The people would have saw it more as sort of square dancing. There's another dance in the terzetto that's maybe not quite so innocent, and I'm going to jump right into that right now. It's from the last movement. If that sounds like a waltz, it's because it is. A certain type of waltz was very popular in the 1830s. A waltz from an opera called Robert le Diable. In Robert le Diable, the Robert character is the son of Satan, but he doesn't have any magic powers of his own. He has to go into an abandoned convent and get a magic stick that will give him the power to paralyze and confuse people. The obstacle to getting the stick are a bunch of ghost nuns who come up out of their graves and dance a waltz. The waltz itself was very popular in the 1830s. People like Franz Liszt made variations on it. Paganini had every reason to like that waltz because it's about somebody with a magic stick, and Paganini himself had the possession of a magic stick. People who came to his concerts could see the devil behind him kind of moving his bow arm and showing him how to use his bow. Or people would say, oh, he must have weights in his bow that he can move with his mind. It was an object of fascination for people in the 19th century, and in 1851 people got a chance to see Paganini's bow. It had been donated to a museum in Genoa, and you could go there and see the bow. In the opera, the stick is broken into pieces and loses its magic power. In the museum, you could look at the bow and realize it didn't have its magic power anymore. It had been broken into 8 pieces and sort of clumsily repaired by Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume, the violin dealer. People gave up all hope of ever hearing what Paganini's bow sounded like. That was until the 1980s, when Paganini's bow was discovered. The bow had been in the possession of Paganini's heirs. It had passed down from generation to generation. All of Paganini's other instruments had been sold off. The bow was sold finally to a Swiss collector. It was with a bunch of concert programs and old concert clothes. The Swiss collector sold the bow to a violin shop in Switzerland, and then it came into the American market. People were very confused about the bow because it wasn't a typical modern bow. It was a bow from the 1790s. have that bow right here. I've been using it. And it is indeed a violin bow from the 1790s. It has a very heavy tip, and the tip is heavier than the modern viola bow. It has a very light frog. It has an open trench frog, and it's very light in the hand and very heavy in the tip, and that's the magic weight effect. When it was first made available to collectors in the 1980s, people didn't really believe that Paganini had used it. But it later came to light that there's a portrait, the Daniel Maclise portrait, and it shows Paganini very clearly using the bow. There's a little detail of the bow. It has a funny little collar that has been engraved, and you can see that little collar on that Daniel Maclise portrait from 1831. The bow had a very great disadvantage for violinists who used it. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, violin strings were very delicate, and it took nothing to break them. Once you broke it, it might be very hard to replace because the manufacturing process that allowed people to make delicate strings had kind of fallen by the wayside. We think in the 1790s, when the bow was first made, it was used in a certain type of opera, an opera where cannon were used as a musical effect. They didn't put cannonballs in them, they just shot them off. The violinists had to compete with that. They probably broke their E strings early in the process and didn't need them. If you look at that music, it just climbs up for the high notes on the A string. So the violinist would play the E string notes on the A string, and that had to do. Paganini used this trick all the time. He would just sometimes cut his E string, or maybe it was constantly broken. He could cut the A string and the D string and play a whole concert just on the lowest string of the violin. That wasn't just entirely a trick. It may have also been a necessity. Violinists in the early part of the 19th century, if they broke their E string, may have had to do without it. And we're going to examine that as a possibility as we go on to a violin sonata. The next work I'm going to play is a violin sonata that Paganini published in 1829. It's for violin and guitar. We don't know exactly how Paganini expected this to be played, but Paganini did not like to play his violin at parties. And I always suspected that he brought these violin sonatas and his guitar to parties, and he would offer the violin part to one of the violinists at the party, and he would just sit and strum his guitar. I'm going to play this violin sonata on the viola, and this is going to demonstrate a little bit of that technique of just not assuming that you have an E string and just climbing up onto the A string and playing up high. The other aspect of this sonata that I think is important is I'm going to play a lyrical theme from the sonata. There was an idea in the 1820s that Paganini had learned to play the violin in jail, that he'd been arrested and put into prison for murdering his mistress, and that in the ensuing 8 years he had just sat around and studied how to play the violin. Paganini probably didn't really like this rumor, but he took advantage of it anyway. And it's possible to imagine as I play this lyrical melody that I'm in prison and maybe learning how to play the violin, wondering about that day when I'm finally going to be let out of prison and allowed to play in all the great capitals of Europe. That theme. we're going to stop right here, and we're going to come back with more of the terzetto. I'm going to play a little bit more of the terzetto now. I'm going to play a little bit of the lyrical theme from the first movement. Compared to the violin sonata that we heard just a moment ago, I'm a little bit disappointed. This theme is very simple. We've got to bear in mind that I'm not exactly playing a Stradivari viola. I'm not using gut strings. I'm using vibrato, which Paganini never used. And also, when you hear the whole piece, there's a cello who's helping me out. But even so, this was an unusually simple theme compared to Paganini's other works. The critics really liked it. They said, this is Paganini without all the tricks. It was Paganini's one great critical success in 1833. He wrote to his friend Luigi Germi, I put all the critics to shame with my Il mio cannone violino, with my violin/canon. I think he may have been referring to the bow. Hector Berlioz heard about his success and in late 1833 met up with Paganini and said, I'd like to write you a viola concerto. It's debatable whether Paganini was actually interested or not, but in 1834, Hector Berlioz did write a viola concerto, his Herald in Italy. He took as part of his model the much simpler style of Paganini that we heard in the terzetto. I'm going to play just a little bit of the opening melody in the viola from Herald in Italy. Berlioz's Herald in Italy was also a massive critical success. Violinists who couldn't get a job playing violin concertos loved to play it, and audience loved to hear it. In the later part of the 1830s and into the 1840s, you couldn't hear Paganini's music anymore. Paganini retired from the stage and died in 1840, but he also kept a lot of his great music away from publication, including all the violin concertos. If you wanted to hear his music, you had to go to a concert by Franz Liszt, who arranged a lot of Paganini's music for piano. It was one of the great early successes for Franz Liszt on the concert stage. I think violists would do well to add the Terzetto Concertante to their repertoire, but I think they should also take a look at the violin sonatas from the 1820s.